Now let's go over how to pass data into an action creator. Ideally, I would show you how to do this with an input field and show you how to save the user input to Redux. However, when I was creating the tutorial, I realized it was overly complex since we would have to set up two helper functions that extract the input with the synthetic event and then send that data to the Redux state. And I actually went over forms in React in the React module, and going over it again would take away from the action creator part too much. So to avoid that, I'll give you a simpler example using a button and a variable, and this will simulate getting data from the user input. And if you watch the React form tutorial and this tutorial, you will be able to do that on your own. And I'll also show you how to save the user input text to the Redux state in the project module. So if you can look in that module if you want to know how to do it. With that said, let's start in our action types file and create a new action type, and let's call this type a user input. We can now go to our action files and create a new action creator. Let's also name this action creator to user input. And unlike our other two action creators, we will pass in a parameter to this action creator. And let's call this parameter text. In our return statement, we can also set a second property to action, which we'll call payload. And for now, we can just set our text parameter to the value of the payload. In a real-world app, you would ideally want to set up payload as a JavaScript object, but for now this is fine. And we also have to update our reducer to handle this new piece of state. Let's begin by setting a new property to our initial state, and let's call this property user text and set it to an empty string. Now let's create a new case statement to handle our new action type. Inside of our return statement, we can create a new copy of the state with a spread operator. Then we set our newly created state property of user text to action.payload. And where is this action.payload coming from? Let's retrace our steps. Note that our reducer takes two arguments, state and action. The action is the exact same action we defined in the actions file. If we look at our actions file, we see that the action we returned, which is a JS object, has a property of type and payload. And so this entire JavaScript object is available in the reducer, and the entire actions object is available in the actions parameter. Now with the Redux store setup completed, we can begin setting up our container. As mentioned, we will simulate a user input with a button and a string variable instead of having to set up an entire form. Let's create another button and call it dispatch action creator 3. And let's also create a string variable in our render method. And you can make this anything you want. I'll just make it text1. And then same as before, in the onClick event, we call action creator 3. And let's also define this in our map dispatch to props method. For now, let's just set it up as we did with our other action creators and leave the parameters empty. And we can begin to discuss how we would pass in our data. We first need to pass it in as a parameter to our action creators 3 call in our button. Simply pass in user text to the action dispatch. You can essentially imagine this string as an extracted value from a form or an input element. Next, we'll need to pass this parameter in our action creator 3 property in our map dispatch to props method. In the arrow function, we can just pass in text because we're basically saying that this function should have one argument. but the actual value of the parameter we have to pass in to our render method. For the same reason, we can just pass text to the dispatch action creator call. And this is it. Let's save everything and test our app. Let's first click on the dispatch action 3 button, and let's get the state from the get state button. We're getting false and our new user text property is not showing up at all. Let's look back at our code to see what's happening, and let's do this in the next section.